Welcome to the Zedeucation podcast, where it's all about helping people and organizations unleash their greatness. Hosted by me, Pasitawa Haufano, and my brother.
That's me, Kalolo Haufano.
The Zedeucation podcast features lively discussions.
When they share it, you see that they're beginning to feel empowered.
My heart, it's full of pride for me to be at Maitai Samoa.
As well as tips on leadership and business by some of the top minds and influencers around the world.
You don't necessarily need a degree these days. There's so many pathways to success.
Welcome to the Zedeucation podcast. Welcome to our Zedeucation podcast episode today. We're pleased to introduce Dr. Alexander Stevens II on our episode. As the founder of StandingTallNewZealand.org, Dr. Stevens is a prominent advocate for Māori and Pacific men recovering from childhood sexual abuse. His innovative online platform offers crucial support to survivors and guides community organizations in handling sexual abuse disclosures. Dr. Stevens' expertise spans several critical fields. He's a dual diagnosis clinician, a kaupapa Māori researcher, and educator in adult learning. His work in sexual and domestic violence, trauma, Indigenous research, mental health, and LGBTIQA+ issues has made him a key figure in shaping strategies for recovery at community levels and government levels here in Aotearoa. Joining us in exploring Dr. Stevens' impactful journey and his contribution to personal development and trauma recovery, this interview is a must listen for anyone interested in personal development, mental health awareness, and creating supportive environments in both personal and professional settings. So, welcome to our show, brother.
Kia ora, warm Pacific greetings.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you so much. I guess just to kind of kick things off here, share something interesting about yourself, Doctor.
I've had the pleasure of touching Sir Edmund Hillary's equipment as he went up to Everest. That's probably my little thing that I've always thought was quite exciting. You know, here's this New Zealander, this prominent New Zealander featured on our $5 note, who obviously did this massive achievement of going up Everest and being able to touch something that he once had is quite exciting.
Yeah.
For me. Like a bit of history.
Oh, exactly. You know? Something to be proud of. I mean, it wasn't you, but it's someone that that inspires you.
Yeah, I thought so. Given the nature of what we're going to be talking about today, right, and being able to reach different heights of comfortability around this topic, I kind of associate myself as a version of him, just continuously climbing up different mountains that have various difficulties.
I love
challenges.
it.
Yeah.
I love it. I love the metaphor there.
Thank you.
Beautiful start. Thank you for sharing that. I guess maybe let's start with your story and your journey. Tell us a little bit about how you got to and what inspired you to establish StandingTallNewZealand.org, particularly focusing on Māori and Pacific men's recovery from childhood sexual abuse.
Yeah. So just a little bit of context, Masi. My background as a clinician and counsellor, and I've been doing it for over 20 years now. I received my first disclosure back when I was in Otahu College, about 16 years old. And as a young person, I had no skill sets to be able to deal with it, you know. And I remember finding out a year later that he had taken his own life, and the only thing that I did at the time was just talk to a guidance counsellor about what had happened before he had done this thing, you know, a year later. And when I'd found out what had happened, it really did profoundly affect me in lots of ways, but more so around, you know, why wasn't he helped? Did he try to reach out to somebody else? You know, that kind of thing. So I often think our experiences shape who we become as young people and then as adults, and then subsequently that particular feature of getting disclosures happen quite regularly and with frequency.
Yeah, I remember reading that in your PhD report. And thank you for sending that through. 353 pages. I went through all of it, and I read that story in there.
Yeah.
And I just thought, wow, you know, how traumatizing that would have been for the kid
Yes.
But also, I mean, he felt safe enough to open up to you, but also the impact that it had on you. Like, what do I do with this as a kid? This is pretty big.
Yeah. And in my family, we both work in the trades as well as health. And so for me, I've resonated more with the health side and mental health and addictions. And more and more, I just started getting disclosures almost on a weekly kind of basis from our Māori and Pacific men in particular. And just recognise that there are multiple challenges that come with that. And so that's kind of what caused that PhD really was about how do we provide a talanoa, a kōrero about this particular topic, because it continues to be difficult for the community to acknowledge not only sexual abuse in general, but that it does happen, and that it not only happens to our girls, which is unacceptable, but it also happens to our boys as well.
Yeah, I noticed that in your research as well, in terms of you found there was a gap. There wasn't much information or research done, especially for Pacifica
Yes.
and Māori as well.
Yeah, and the word gap is more of an academic term to describe chasm. There's just a huge chasm of non-information that's available. But when we look at stats like, say, suicide, mental health, and addictions, sexual violence is never kind of factored in it. And as a public health person, I'm always interested about interconnections. We tend to kind of focus on that person that might have a drinking problem or a meth problem or marijuana or whatever it is. But I'm always thinking that those are the side effects. What are the things that are causing that person to do that particular thing? And I'm not saying that this applies to everyone, but it does work out roughly about 1 in 5 Pacific males have experienced some kind of sexual abuse. And for our Māori population, for our men, it's about 1 in 4. So we're talking quite high numbers in this country. And I just feel, to be clear, I feel that it's well and truly above time that we have this conversation in the community, acknowledging that it's hard. Not only in general, but even in the Pacific communities, there's all kinds of taboos around it. But again, when I think about those who have attempted to take their lives, are in and out of jail, so 70 to 80%, something like that anyway, have been affected by sexual abuse. I think actually the sooner that we get the help that our tāne, our men need, the sooner that it's much more likely they can find a way forward that's conducive to their well-being and not destructive.
Yeah, and that's very sad to hear those stats, especially when I think I read in your report, for the general population, it's 1 in 6, but for Pacifica, 1 in 5 for the men, and
right.
for Māori, it's 1 in 4.
That's correct.
So why, based on your research and what you know, why is it so high?
There's a number of things that kind of contribute to it. Unfortunately, this is like one straight reason. Mainly, what I tend to find is that offenders tend to focus on what I call vulnerable population groups. So groups that are often isolated, so families that are often isolated from the rest of the community. Offenders are very particular about looking at who they can and can't abuse. I almost call it predatory because, in a sense, that's what it is. And often our Māori and Pacific, and I'm always kind of mindful about stereotypes, but we are in lots of vulnerable positions, and I often find that in those vulnerable positions is where there are people that want to take advantage of our boys, for example. And we've seen that, there's been news around, like prominent schools, for example, which is often where it can start. I was thinking Dilworth, for example, there was a lot of media attention about that, where they've had a few hundred people come forward. Some of those from Māori and Pacific descent had actually approached me to get help because what their experiences in that school system subsequently affected everything else. So, often people that are in trusting positions are the ones that take advantage of our Māori and Pacific boys.
And that's very unfortunate. And it's not about picking on any race or anything like that. It's just highlighting the stats there and being aware of it and what we can do to support.
Well, the reality very quickly is that there is no specific ethnicity when it comes to offenders. They're all shapes and sizes, male and female. And if anything, whenever I say that there are female offenders, often you'll get a bit of pushback. But they exist. They exist.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I guess we can go really deep into that aspect in terms of female versus male offenders, etc. But I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier. Those who are in most vulnerable positions are the ones who are at most risk.
Yes.
What do you mean by vulnerable? Like, what does that
Yeah,
mean?
well, it's kind of a word that's used all the time now to mean different things. I mean, families that might come from low socio-economic, for example, who might have opportunities to, I don't know, go out on camps or do something outside the norm. Now, can I say whānau, ainga? As you're listening to this, don't just assume that someone's, invited you to camp, that means sexual abuse. But what I mean is that there are opportunities where families or children might be able to do something that they don't normally get exposed to. And then there's a period of grooming that takes place, and then, that precipitates to sexual abuse.
Yeah. And I think as a parent, that means a lot to me. I mean, I've got children of my own. I've got 3, and so I'm really aware. And it's not me being overprotective, because some people use that, or being too strict. I'm just being protective of my children. I'm mindful of where they go and sleep over, who they spend time with. It doesn't matter if they're family or not family. For me, that's important.
Absolutely, and that's why there's such a huge. Where I work in health and social services, people get police checked all the time, and it's for that reason, to ensure that you're working with someone, safe, who hasn't done anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I want to talk about, because especially with your expertise and experience around the community level, and also consulting government, because I know government's got their own strategy. But let's bring it down to the family unit, like especially with parents and that within the home. What are some things that we can do in the home, ainga o whānau, to help protect or prevent these things from happening?
Yeah, I think the best thing that you can do is just listen if you get, someone discloses that they've been sexually abused or touched, because generally speaking, our children don't make this up. So, a lot of the stuff that I wrote in my research and stuff that I didn't include is that most of our men came forward as boys between the ages of 5 to 7 initially. And then they tried coming forward around the ages of 11 to 13. And if they're not believed then, they'll give it 2 more times, often in their mid to late 20s, because often that's when they're going to become a dad. So then they start to freak out because they want to be the best father possible. And if they're not believed then often we're dealing with kind of end of life stuff. So stuff like kidney dialysis, cancer, that kind of thing, where it's stopped being a disclosure, but almost like a spiritual release of the burden that they've had. So, to answer your question, I think, listen and actually believe that if someone has told you, irrespective of gender, that they have been touched by whoever, to believe them. I also know that there's all kinds of complexities, especially if it's a family member or someone in a high position. But having dealt and counselled with thousands of Māori and Pacific men, if they're not believed and trusted in the initial stages of telling someone, then it just becomes harder, if not impossible, for them to get help.
Yeah, I think listening is very, very important. You provide a space for people to open up, whether they have challenges or no challenges, you just make it a norm, And I want to touch on, let's go back to, the kid that you were, who heard this story. This kid at school opened up to you and said, this is what happened to me. And unfortunately, later on in life, you found out that he had taken his own life. I guess, if you were to go back to that kid that you were before, what would you have done differently, or what could you have done now with the knowledge that you have to help support?
Yeah, 2 things. I mean, keeping in mind that a 16-year-old, version of me isn't the 40-something-year-old version of me that I am now. I probably would have pushed more for him to have gone and seen a guidance counsellor. I mean, like I said before, I just went there and said, this person told me this. I actually probably would have gone with him. Looking back, and again, I guess within my own age, would have been looking at what other kind of support, would he have needed to help him. I mean, that's the thing about suicide, is that, often you get left without answers. But I do genuinely believe, looking back now with our eyes and with all the therapeutic lens that I do, have, I genuinely believe that had he have had a wraparound approach, it could have ended up differently for them.
Yeah. And I mean, the reason why I asked this question, I mean, I know you're 40 something now and go back there with the experiences, because I feel like some people open up to their friends.
Yes.
And they might be younger.
Yes.
They might have a lot more confidence because they got that connection. I'm too afraid to go speak to my parents because of, you know, the offender might be someone they know,
Yes.
etc., or something like that.
Highly
and
likely.
So I guess what I'm hearing here is, you know, it's important for us to understand what the support is out there, so that we could either for ourselves or others that we know and guide them there.
Yes.
You know.
I mean, support people are key. That's the thing that I've walked away with. Not only working in the field, but also with the research as well. Just one support person is all it takes to turn that person's life around. For our Māori and Pacific men in particular, it's really interesting the way that they disclose. They'll often, again, and this is working with thousands of individuals, they'll often disclose if they're half cut, so they might be slightly drunk. They'll often tell their bro maybe in a car, which I've often thought about, but it actually makes sense because you've got two people that are facing in one direction, so they're not doing this kind of contact. And interesting enough, in my research, they often disclosed eating food, which isn't a surprise given our Māori and Pacific nature for love of eating, but there's something that kind of acts as a barrier, or maybe something to reduce a barrier in order for them to be able to say what's happened. So, I mean, that's the exciting stuff about being a researcher as well, as learning actually what makes our bros disclose. What is it about you as a support person that they trust? Often, like I said before, often it's with teachers that they tell first, which makes sense because actually teachers kind of have this role of protector and guide, especially when you're young. And if a teacher doesn't believe them, like I said, it's on to 11 or 13 that you'll give it a go. And it's often what you're saying, they'll give it a go by talking to their friends. And then if it's not their friends, then they'll try to at least one more time in their mid to late 20s. But yeah, just listening, that's what I'm saying, listening is key. You don't need to know all the answers. And in fact, sometimes just saying, look, I have no idea what you want me to do with this. Sometimes they just want to get it out and have someone believe them. And then they kind of calm the farm, take a chill pill, and then think, what do I want to do from here?
Yeah, I think something I'm hearing time and time again, especially with what you're sharing, is how important listening is. And you don't have to listen to provide solutions or give an answer. Sometimes just listening, just being there is enough for them to start the healing process. And I guess let's talk about the healing process, you know, which is very important. I understand you have a Māori approach.
Oh, yes.
Or like, you know, applying a cultural lens to the healing process. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why is that so important and how is that so beneficial?
Yeah, so when I did my second master's, I worked with the University of Toronto and AUT to look at our Māori and Pacific frameworks and see how effective they are dealing with sexual abuse. So, you know, we've got like whono whale, we've got te whare tapawha and te wheke, which are frameworks to help tauiwi or non-Māori or Pacific look at our worldviews. And what I realised when it comes to sexual abuse, those frameworks, I'm going to get booed, but you know, those frameworks don't have the ability to deal with the complexities of sexual abuse, but also help practitioners try to do things the best that they can. So I took a step back initially for my PhD to create a framework in order to step back in and actually apply it and see how effective it is. Anyway, long story short, it's an 8-step approach using our Māori cosmology, you know, looking at things like chaos, which is te kore, which is opportunities. How do we have the right environment to support our Māori and Pacific men? How do we help them understand what's happening? What kind of community supports do they need? What does emotional support look like? Physical needs, and how do we wrap that round within wairua or spirit? Because actually, even a lot of Māori and Pacific men that I've worked with might not have a full understanding of spirit, but know that there's something out there. So how do we do all of that in a meaningful way, which is what that framework is about.
Yeah, can you break that down again, the 8-step
Yeah,
framework?
and I'll give examples, So if we looked at te kore, which is the state of chaos, so in Māori cosmology, we say that we came from the realm of chaos. Think of it like before the Big Bang, right? And so for our bros that are coming forward, they might often have, like I said, drug and alcohol issues. They might have a lot of barriers. They might find out, for example, that they're going to be a dad for the first time and they're scared about what does this mean. So that's the chaos element. Te kore is about potential. So yes, you've come forward, and how can we help you? So one of the questions, there are a couple of questions that our guys ask. One is, am I going to be an abuser just because I was abused? And actually the answer is no. There's a stereotype out there that because you've been sexually abused, therefore you're going to do it to others. That's simply not the case. It's actually much more complex than that. So it's about reassuring our bros. Being a victim doesn't necessarily mean you're going to become an offender. So that's what I mean by te kore opportunities. And then whenua is about how do we create a therapeutic environment to kind of figure out what's happening. So like I said, most guys that I work with have got really complex needs. Sometimes, as a quick example, drug and alcohol, mental health, but they might be awhakasi, so they might be Māori and Pacific. In fact, many of them are, because I live in South Auckland. So they're kind of also wrestling with different identities and different values. And then when they talk about being sexually abused, they might not be able to say more in the Pacific community. There's probably a no-no. Māori community might be a little bit more accepting, and even then we've still got our own challenges. And then understanding is, what do we do with this? So now that we have an understanding of what your environment looks like, you now see an opportunity to get the help, and we understand your chaos. What can we do, meaningfully to find our way forward? And it could be counselling, it could be life coach, it could be mentoring. There's all kinds of stuff. And then part of that journey is that hapori, that community. So, everyone's got someone in their life. And so what can you do to get some kind of support person or friend, whānau member maybe, to help you? And then I look at working with their emotional stuff, because there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of hatred, self-hatred around what's happened, but also a lot of hatred to the person or people that caused that hurt. And then physical stuff could just be things like incorporating exercise, going out with the boys and actually enjoying yourself, like sports, for example, like doing all that kind of physical activity. And then wairoa could be, or spirit could be, going to church, for example, or it could be actually spending time out in nature or with their children, just doing things that help to replenish them. Not all, but I do work with a lot of men with a lot of anger issues. Like I said, they really hate themselves. And some of them, for example, go in and out of court for stuff, not sexually abuse related, but other stuff, and they want to be reconnected with their children. So that framework helps me as a practitioner manage these really complex things. And then as an academic, it's about how do I write this up so that perhaps other practitioners or services might want to try this framework as well.
I love that. Thank you for breaking it down for us. And what I love about that journey, what I'm hearing is that people go through a self-discovery and redefining and be like, this is who I am, and doing things or finding things that help them to become the best version of themselves, which I love. And I love the cultural aspect to it as well, the 8 step that you've broken it down. And that's something that other people can use. It's tangible, it's practical as well. So this is a framework that you use at Stantor.
Yep.
Awesome. Can you, before we get into some of your workshops and all of that, because thank you for providing insights in terms of what we can do at a community level, a support level. What about, what is the government? What are you seeing at a national level? What is the government doing to help? Because I understand they've got this Te Aorere Kura, and I've looked into it. It's a national strategy or framework that they've implemented or rolled out to help eliminate domestic violence and sexual violence as well. So can you talk a little bit about that? And
I should say that from time to time I do get contracted by the government to do some of this work. So what I'm about to say to you might actually put me at risk, but then I don't care, because in order to help our communities, we have to have brave conversations. And I just thought, this is a perfect example of going on here and actually doing it right. I mean, short story, but how on earth can we expect our bros to come forward if we're not prepared on our side to have conversations about some of the challenges that we face? One of the reasons that I did my PhD was because, and you know this too, there's something magical about those 3 letters at a government level who will hear you because you happen to have the title doctor. My clients don't care what my title is. What my clients care about is that they're going to get help. However, at a government level, having a PhD, having a doctorate makes a huge difference, because you are a foremost expert in an area. Mine happens to be Māori and Pacific men, recovering from sexual abuse. So when we look at Te Arere Kora, the vision seems good enough. Let's eliminate violence, so family harm as well as sexual harm. But one of the key areas that I continue to respectfully argue is that we ignore the needs of our boys and our men, either deliberately or not. Sometimes I think our focus is on women and children. But what I'd say to you is, when we talk about children, we're actually talking about girls more often than not. But given the stats that I told you before, 1 in 4 for our Pacific males and roughly 1 in 5 based on my own academic research, where's that narrative of supporting our boys and men reflected in Te Arere Kora? So where I have been contracted by government departments, it really has been to look at what are you doing to support our men to find a way forward. That's what led me to create Standing Tall in Z.org as part of my PhD. Our men, generally speaking, want to find like for like. So in other words, they want to try to find other Māori and Pacific men to talk to, not necessarily just about the sexual abuse that's happened, but because we have values that are very similar. So if we call each other like bro or doko or whatever, then we know who we know what we're talking about. And if someone mispronounces it, then you don't have to cringe at the same time and think, well, if they're going to get this wrong, what else are they going to get wrong? And so I've worked with governments to help explore not only working with our men in general, but how do we work with our disability community, because they have the highest stats. And if you happen to be Māori and Pacific, you're even at the unfortunately, you're kind of the cream of the crop of those that are much more likely to be affected by sexual trauma and or violence, full stop. That also goes with our rainbow community, so takata, poi, whawhawhine, whakaleiti communities as well, So I really work in those dark areas that no one really wants to, kind of work in. But I am hoping that by working with government agencies and warmly challenging them, using my title as doctor, that change will slowly happen to the point where it's my intention to try to be unemployed in this area and leave it to future generations of Māori and Pacific practitioners and others in the community to kind of take the mantle.
So, wow, it's so cool that you get to work and consult at that level, especially, it's a title, but you've worked hard. You've done the research, you've gone through the challenges and, the experience yourself. So there's a lot of weight behind it, behind that title, a lot of mana as well,
yes,
that will actually support the client and also help the government support everyone else as well. And it's so cool that you're there to help not just the people who the victims,
yes,
but also trying to help the government, but also helping the practitioners as well.
Yes.
So you're involved in all these areas, these moving parts to help support this part here. Can you talk a little bit about, your workshops that you provide that help? So Stand Tall New Zealand.
Yeah, so Standing Tall NZ.org does run workshops, and this is because in the field, sexual abuse isn't talked about in general. It's a really hard topic. In fact, by law, if you go into hospital, nurses are required to ask people with injuries if they are in a domestic violent relationship. And nurses say that they struggle just to ask that, to women. Asking a man that is almost an impossibility for all kinds of reasons. And there's no way we're going to be anywhere near the idea of asking someone, if you've experienced childhood sexual abuse, depending on the context. So my workshops really focus on dealing with topics like, if you get a sexual abuse disclosure, how do you manage that? What does that look like? I also run workshops on how do we support our disability and our Māori and Pacific Rainbow communities as well, because they have very specific challenges. I also do, which is the hardest workshop I find, is how do we bring the offender and victim, if they're in the family, and find a way forward. So those are just some of the general workshops that I run. And then there's also one on financial harm as well, because often that can be a deciding factor that's underlined under, really all this other stuff.
That's great. And this is workshops that you deliver within the community, but also do you work with employers?
Yep, all of the above. Primarily I work in Māori and Pacific services, because we know that, put it this way, if you work in mental health and addictions, then you're more than likely going to get some kind of disclosure if they feel safe with you. But then I've also worked with organisations that purely do housing, but in that process of feeling safe because they're finally in an environment, as if you go back to my framework, Te Ao Marama, that environment is conducive for them to finally feel like they're in a space where they can actually, talk about what happened. But then I also get, phone calls from, say, like Countdown, for example, where some managers found me on Google because one of their staff members has been triggered because they saw the offender at their job. And so it's really hit them hard, and they hadn't seen them for maybe 15 years, but it all comes back. And that's the thing, this topic is hard, but it's not impossible, and we don't know when something might come up. But anyway, but I guess where I was going with all of that was there's really clear research to show the health professionals, but even social workers and teachers just don't know how to deal with this topic.
Yeah, I guess what is some advice or support that you can give to those who might be working with or come across these situations?
Yeah, so here's the thing. The best thing that I can say for our professionals that, like I said, our teachers, our social workers, nurses, doctors, counsellors, so on and so forth, is don't panic. Our bros from the research have said time and time again, whenever they see a look of panic on someone's face, they're just going to close it down because they just think, this person isn't going to help me in a conducive way. I always say to people, which might be a bit strange, I always say to people to see it as a badge of honour that someone has disclosed to you, because obviously there is something about you as a human being that they've connected with as a fellow human being that they feel safe enough to tell you. And given that this isn't your area of expertise, then, ask that person, what do you want me to do? So you've told me this, but what do you want me to do about it? Because most guys, like I said, they just want to be heard initially, and sometimes they just want time to kind of process, well, if this person's believed me and hasn't freaked out, then maybe I could tell somebody else, maybe like a counsellor or a therapist. And for our social and health professionals or educational professionals, it's really about, asking them if they'd be prepared to walk a path with you to get the right kind of support, because you might be it. And the thing with our men is that there's only one go, generally speaking, one go at trying to get help. So if they don't get it, it's highly unlikely they won't try again, because there's a biofeedback that occurs where offenders and predators have said, if you tell someone, they're not going to believe you, they're going to think that it's your fault, etc., etc. So, when you panic, when that person panics in front of them, then it triggers that response of, I told you so. Even though it's a lie, told you so, shut down. And then they try to carry on the best that they can.
Yeah. That's so sad to hear that. But then again, I love the advice. Don't panic, because I can already envision, if someone sees you panic, it's like, oh, this is bad. I can't, they're panicking too. So how can I confide and trust, put confidence in them to help me?
Yes. Sometimes, as you know, our Māori and Pacific, we've got an amazing sense of humour too. So sometimes we'll try to use humour as a coping mechanism to try to. We're like, sole kind of thing, or don't even go there, and then we try to laugh it off. But even then, I say to people, resist the urge to laugh it off, because even then, you can trigger our bros. Because in a sense, what they're doing is something very rare, in that they're revealing their wounded wairua, their wounded spirit to you. So in that moment, in all their rawness, they've chosen you as the individual, and so therefore, any judgment, stigma, any kind of laughing is just another burden on top. So, and then, like I said, then they close down and continue with the drinking or the other stuff that's self-harming.
Yeah, or other ways that they can cope with it and manage it, or find a distraction.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about that? You know, like, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Like, people just try and switch off or zone out from it and pretend it never happened, kind of thing. But like you were saying, it catches up sometimes later on.
Sure does.
And you know what happens? Can you talk about the impact if someone doesn't, I guess, deal with it or face it?
Yeah.
Because I know you can't just solve it just like that, and sometimes it's your whole
Yes.
life journey healing.
Yes.
What are the impacts of that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things to factor in. Often they'll leave school early because they feel so hurt and so rejected, and often they'll try drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism. And we know that in our formative years that drugs and alcohol can have a huge impact on brain development as well. So often they'll leave school. They'll often have, not everyone, but they'll often have ongoing social anxiety, anger issues, which all makes sense if you think about the initial cause of it. Remember how I said from a public health view, I'm interested in the roots, not the branches. What's the thing that's happening under the surface? So they'll often have anxiety. They'll often have anger issues. If they find a relationship and have children, sometimes they'll feel disconnected. Often partners will say that, that in intimate acts it can either feel incredibly uncomfortable or rough, or that their partners feel disconnected, because often they themselves have been disconnected because they haven't had that chance. And I do work with the court system. So I have a lot of bros, and I use the word bros because I tend to use that rather than victim or survivor, right? But a lot of bros that come forward and they're going to court for having anger issues, like lashing out. Again, not everyone, but lashing out against partners, against children, or they've either been drunk, they've done something stupid, they've had a fight at work, that kind of thing. So I do a lot of court work, and in that court work, I do a lot of therapy to help them understand that this event or series of events has actually resulted often in what's happened. And when our bros actually realise, the length and depth of what's happened to them, it can be quite overwhelming. But their goals often for the men that I work with, is to try to get back into their children's lives, to try to turn their life around. So many of the men that I work with, for example, have stopped drinking for 2 or 3 years. It's part of it. If you're working with me, for example, it's kind of like a no negotiation. You have to quit everything. You really do, and we have to be real with ourselves to find a way forward. And if you're prepared to do this, then I'll be prepared to, and this is free, right? I'll be prepared to go to court with you to write your clinical report or support letter to your lawyer to give to the judge. And I'd say 99% of the time, the bros that work with me have been, back into their children's lives. That might not be back in the core, of family, under the same roof, but they're able to see their children regularly. They're able to hold down a job. They're able to have more money in their account because they're not spending it on trying to fill something that was, hurting them. So there's a whole lot of benefits that come, once our men take a step to get help. But it's always that step that's the scariest thing if they've already tried it before. Like a step where I get slapped back. So what's going to stop it from happening now? And can I also say to you, my friend, that the other challenge is sometimes our bros can't believe that things are changing, because they've often told themselves, it's almost like an education in a way, they've kind of told themselves this narrative, this is who I am, and I'm never going to get there. And then suddenly when they realise that they're like this close to getting what they want, all of a sudden they're like rugby stars and deciding to run in the opposite direction. So when I work with our men, for example, very early on I talk about that fear of success can actually be far more scarier than fear of failure, because they've always wanted it, but actually have never experienced it until this moment.
Yeah, I love that, and it gives hope in the healing, and that it is possible. I guess what are you seeing as the common turning point, or I mean, everyone's different, and everyone responds differently, and everyone's journey. But what seems to be the common catalyst or the changing turning point for people to get them on I believe it. Yes, I'm on the right path. I'm going to keep going forward.
Yeah. So if we talked about say our general male population, it's often centred on trying to get their family back. That's the main thing. Most of the men that I work with identify straight and heterosexual, so about 90% of my clients are anyway, and so they're very clear. You know, like they're often living in accommodation. They might be living in their car. You know, they've really hit rock bottom, and are wanting, like I said, to either come back home, work with their relationships, work with their wives, and or if that's not possible, just see their kids on a weekly or, you know, fortnightly or monthly basis, depending on what the courts have kind of allowed. For our rainbow, our takatapo, our whakalaiti, our whawhawhine community, for them, you know, it's a bit more complicated because the ones that I tend to work with have actually been excluded from the family because of the trauma and stigma, and so it's complex stuff. And with our disability community, it's the same kind of thing because often they're socially isolated, and in that particular case, I might actually go and see them, for example. So, you know, like in I'd say rural areas are a great example. So I cover Auckland all the way down to Hamilton. In rural areas, for example, where lots of our Māori and Pacific have started to migrate to, and if they have a disability, they might not be able to get a bus up to where I am at Manukau City, or a train for that matter. Do you know what I mean? They might struggle just to get to the letterbox, so we have to find creative ways of being able to help people. But I guess that's the turning point anyway. And more often than not, it really is family and or children that our bros have said, actually, this is why I want to do it. I want to break a cycle, especially if there's been generational abuse, that they want to be the one to stop it. And I've always said to our Māori and Pacific whānau, violence has existed in various ways across islands, and including New Zealand. But actually missionaries wrote about, they called it an abnormality around how we raised our children with love and respect compared to those Victorian values of a child should be seen and not heard, and then actively work to try to apply this approach to our Polynesian community. That's why I've often found it ironic that almost 300 years later, they're now turning around and what they're selling us is exactly what we did 300 years ago. So there's a sense of irony. One of my friends went to James Cook, and do you know what their motto was?
Something excellence?
Yeah, or endeavour, which then endeavour, right? Yeah. So it's about how do we endeavour to find a way forward? How do we endeavour to name this space? But I just say to them, any boat that comes from, you know, a colonizer, run in the opposite direction and draw on our Māori and Pacific knowledge, like alofa, like aroha. You know, like when we talked about before, what can you do? If you genuinely demonstrate the concept of love from one bro to another, like I'm here, I'm listening to you, that in itself could save many counselling sessions, because finally, you know, there's that hope, which we call tūmanako in Māori, hope that I'm going to be believed and maybe get the right kind of help, you know, that I need.
Wow. There's a lot that you've just shared here, and I've learned so much. And thank you for sharing and just providing value to our audience so they're more aware about the reality of things like this, sexual violence, and what can we do, and what are some of the support. And it's awesome to know, and I hope it gives me a lot of confidence, but people who are listening, to see there's people like yourself who are advocating in this space for our Pacifica and Māori, having someone like you fronting this and taking it head on, and just with love, support, and with a cultural aspect.
Thank you.
And you know, thank you for your service, thank you for the work that you do. It's people like you who in this space who help make a difference for our people, who stand up with courage and just do what you do, you know, with love. And I just, before we draw close to the end of our podcast, you know, and just again, thank you so much. Just two more questions. Last one was just, I guess, speaking to our audience out there, what is some message of hope or I guess courage or inspiration that you want to leave? I guess some final words that you want to give.
Yeah, and I'll do a plug for the website, because that was the whole point of developing standingtallnz.org, was to have specific resources for our Māori and Pacific community. So I guess if I had one key message for our bros that have been impacted by sexual abuse, it's this, that you can find a way forward. It sounds very cliche, but you really can. I know that it's incredibly hard to come forward, but what we know is the sooner that you come forward to get help, the much more likely it is that you can slowly turn your life around. It doesn't happen overnight like a Pantene ad, right? It doesn't happen overnight, but it will happen. And it's the same with our bros, you know, it can take a few seasons to get through. But what I do know, having worked with, I said before, thousands of men, is that it is possible, right? Just bit by bit, day by day, with the right kind of support. For our support people that hear a disclosure, like I said, don't panic. In a way, be honoured that this person has trusted you, so therefore there's something about you that's special. Don't make light of it, because this person's probably told a couple of other people. And the one thing that I've learned is that our Māori and Pacific men are really good at covering what they really feel behind a big smiley face. Do you know what I mean? That we, that kind of smile. Whenever I go overseas, it's not quite the same until I hit Polynesia, where we get that friendly smile, but we don't know what's conveyed behind that smile. Is often pain and suffering, especially for our men that have gone through a lot of trauma. And then for community agencies that listen to this, which is now where I'm going to do my plug, is that, go to standingtallnz.org. That is an academic website that I developed. It does have very specific resources for our population groups that you won't get anywhere else in New Zealand. And how do I know this? Is because part of the last 7 years of doing my PhD thesis was actually reviewing all the websites that were on there. And a very short story, here's the things that they often lacked: Pacific content, Māori content, brown faces, and our way of seeing the world. That's not to say that they're not good. It's just that they didn't necessarily include, our worldviews and our ways of being. But what I do know is that who we are as Māori and Pacific, the one thing that I always say in different roles that I work on is when we work as collective cousins, we do create change, in the same way that our Pacific cousins helped us with all the land marches that happened, and where we stood strong dealing with things like dawn raids, for example. I often find it's not until our backs are against the wall. It's almost like looking out for that brown wave. But, I truly believe that it's that collective approach that we do so well and beautifully that can make such a significant difference to our men who really are hurting, want help, but are just so scared to come forward and actually say, hey, this is what's happened to me.
Wow, thank you for your great advice and final words here on the podcast. And I guess you already done the plug-in, but my final question was, if anybody, whether it's government, employers, or someone just wanting to ask for help, how can they get in touch with you or reach out?
Yeah, so go on to standingtallnz.org. You could also Google me, so Dr. Alexander Stevens II. Apparently, I come up now. I'm on the system. I'm in the matrix, as they say. And check out the website, because that website has the most latest information. It deals with things like, questions that our bros often ask, like, why me? Out of all the people in the world, why was I hurt? Answering questions from support people like, why was I asked? Again, because this is stuff that people don't know about. And it really has lots of podcasts and videos, and I've really done my best working with a collective of volunteers to answer tricky questions that people have. A little bit shy to ask, but that's the whole point of having a website, is that you're not going to have someone approach you first. And then once you have, some idea about what you want to do, then email me, which is alexander@standingtallnz.org, and I'll see what I can do.
Love it. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Alexander Stevens II, for just providing value, bringing aroha, love, and truth into this space for us so that we could all benefit and be lifted together, and for those final words of encouragement for our people out there.
Yeah, sure. Ngā mihi.
Ngā mihi.